It would not be unreasonable to say that a remake for Resident Evil 4 has been eagerly anticipated by fans of the series ever since the success of the Resident Evil 2 remake a few years ago, although some did argue that Resident Evil 4 was still quite playable and not in need of a remake in the same way that 2 and 3 were. I found myself more on the excited side of the fence. Resident Evil 4 was my favorite in the series at one point, and I was eager to see some more modern touches applied to an already great game. So let's take a look and see if the Resident Evil 4 remake live up to the hype and legacy of its predecessor. Control-wise, Leon feels much like how he did in Resident Evil 2, but with a few added tricks. Now he can parry incoming enemy attacks with his knife and perform context-sensitive melee attacks. Making use of these new tricks is crucial to surviving the finely tuned chaos of the game's combat. The combat walks a wonderful tightrope of being immensely gratifying when you are in control, to being tense and potentially overwhelming when you are on the back foot. I never felt like I was out of the fight when things were going poorly, but I also never felt untouchable when I was in control either. There were plenty of times where I would be in the driver's seat for most of an encounter, only to get rammed by a pitchfork villager, and then subsequently blown up by another that was throwing dynamite, and then barely manage to parry the attack that would have killed me moments later. Healing items seemed to come at the perfect pace. I was able to keep myself sustained, but rarely ever was I at 100%. The level design of Resident Evil 4 does an excellent job at providing arenas with enough open space for the broadened combat, while also maintaining some of the more claustrophobic elements of the previous entries. Many areas are open enough for you to run around freely and dodge the hordes of Ganados on your heels, but most of them also have a few tighter passages off to the side or more narrow spots to weave through. These choke points could easily end up turning into dead ends for players who are less spatially aware, but on the flip side they can also be used to funnel several Ganados into a single spot for a shotgun blast or a well-placed grenade. Most arenas typically come with a myriad of environmental hazards for you to take advantage of as well. Leon has a plethora of weapons to make use of in this game. The series standards are all present: handgun, shotgun, magnum, and so on. One of the key differences from the other entries in the franchise is that there is more than one version of each weapon type. There are about half a dozen handguns, 3 shotguns, and 2 magnums, as well as a few extra goodies like a submachine gun or a rifle. This iteration of the game even tosses in a couple of brand new weapons. All of these can be upgraded throughout the game whenever you stop by the merchant. The cool thing about the weapon variety in this game is that it really lets the player fine-tune their experience to what they want it to be. If you value a faster rate of fire and reload speed, your handgun of choice might be the Blacktail. If you would prefer something that is pure damage, your handgun of choice might be the Ret 9. My personal loadout for most of the game was the Ret 9, the Riot Gun, the TMP, and no rifle because using one before the last third of the game is for cowards. The way that Resident Evil 4 handles enemy variety is commendable. The standard Ganados will come at you with a variety of weapons that change throughout the game. Later on, all of the standard enemies have a chance to sprout a parasite out of their head, which widens their attack pool, makes them deal more damage, and allows them to live a bit longer. The more unique enemies include the chainsaw-wielding Ganados, the sledgehammer brutes, and the massive claw-wielding Garradors. None of these mini-bosses are unmanageable on their own, but they do become a bigger thorn in the side when you have to juggle eliminating the chainsaw wielder with keeping the villagers trying to rush you with pitchforks at bay. All of these elements come together to make for an incredible gameplay experience. One of my favorite things to do in the Resident Evil 2 remake was to just dodge around the zombies by manipulating their movement patterns so that I could save on ammo. In this game, it was really fun to take that notion to a further extreme and try to round up as many Ganados as I could to line them up for a shotgun blast or an environmental kill, making each bullet count and trying to dodge around until I could find the ammo I needed or the healing item I was looking for was a kind of thrill that no other entry in the series has given me. The events of Resident Evil 4 take place 6 years after the fall of Raccoon City. Leon Kennedy, now a Special Forces agent, is sent to a remote part of Spain to search for the president's missing daughter. The broad strokes of the Resident Evil 4 story stay largely the same in this version. Where this remake shines, however, is in the adjustments they made to some of the finer details. The game's story does a great job at keeping a healthy amount of the campy charm of the original version, while still being able to bring the overall story into something more tonally consistent with the previous two remakes. Almost every character in the story has been adjusted for the better. Leon is still a wisecracking dork in this version, but he is also given a few really nice humanizing touches, such as his knife being the one that Marvin gave him back in Raccoon City, and his overall story is centered around processing what he went through and trying to prevent something similar from happening. Ashley is a character that arguably benefits the most from these tweaks. She is shown to be much more capable than she used to be, and in general acts in a much more subdued and human way than her more exaggerated original counterpart. The context of many of her actions is changed and made what were some of her worst moments in the original version much easier to stomach. Luis is another major benefactor of the changes to the story. His backstory is adjusted to make him feel like a more involved part of the world, and his more consistent screen time lets his arc play out in a more natural manner. Many of the more notable antagonists were more fleshed out as well, more so in the files that you could read rather than the cutscenes, but it was still a cool bit of characterization to come across. We are given a better idea of what characters like Chieftain Mendez or the Verdugo were like as people before they became monsters, and I found it to be a really cool case of giving me something that I didn't even know I wanted. Resident Evil 4 looks fantastic in the RE engine. The game always looked cool from a design standpoint, but the original version did release towards the start of the everything must be gray and brown phase that video game visuals went through for a few years, so it was really cool to see the game's stellar environments and cool enemy design brought to life with visuals that were less washed out. The modern facelift really lets the body horror elements of the game sing now. There are so many details that clue you into the plaga infection in the villagers' bodies. It gives you a much better sense of how the parasite is puppeting them around even after death in some cases. Despite Resident Evil 4's more linear nature, I think the game did a stellar job at making its major areas feel like legitimate locations. The village was always the most cohesive, but it received a little bit of fine-tuning. The castle feels like it was what got retooled the most, and oh man, I feel like it benefited from that immensely. And while I still believe that the island is the weakest of the three environments, it was much more cohesive this time around, and far more interesting to explore. The sound design in this game is top-notch. When you are approaching an area that has enemies present, you can hear the agitated murmurs of the Ganados. The way the tone of their voices would shift during this murmuring oftentimes made me think I had been spotted, despite not knowing where they could have seen me from. On top of this, there are plenty of other ambient noises to add to the tension and the more relaxed gameplay moments. The voice performances in this game are pretty solid. Nick Apostolidis returns as Leon and does a wonderful job as portraying him as being more than done with everything happening around him. Genevieve Buckner does a good job at portraying this more subdued and believable take on Ashley, and I think the standout performance in this game goes to Christopher Jane as Sadler. His take on the character is much more sinister and leaves much more of an impression on me than Sadler did originally. The Resident Evil 4 remake is a must-play. It gave me everything I wanted from it and then some. The tense and chaotic action is immensely gratifying when you are able to prevail over the hordes of Ganados. The exploration is much more intriguing with the game's newfound eerie atmosphere and more expansive locations, and the characters and story were reworked in a manner that makes a lot more sense than they did previously. All of these elements come together to make what I believe is the definitive way to experience a game that was already an all-time classic.